Fear is often described as subjective, something personal, emotional, impossible to standardize. That idea is comforting, and it's wrong. In cinema, fear is not an accident. It is the result of deliberate technical decisions made long before an audience ever reacts. Long before music swells, before performances intensify, before a story reaches its conclusion. Horror works not because it feels chaotic, but because it is controlled. These films do not rely on shock mythology or narrative twists to unsettle the viewer. They rely on construction, on restriction, on the careful removal of information. Camera placement limits what can be seen. Sound design withholds cues the brain expects. Editing rhythms disrupt anticipation. Framing dictates where attention is allowed to rest and where it is not. The audience does not consciously register these decisions. They respond to them, automatically, physiologically, predictably. This is why certain horror films remain effective, even after repeated viewings. The fear does not come from surprise. It comes from systems that continue to operate regardless of familiarity. The mechanism keeps functioning. In this video, we are not examining stories. We are not revisiting plots, characters, or moments meant to shock. We are breaking down how fear is engineered, film by film, mechanism by mechanism. Each entry focuses on a single technical choice and how it shapes viewer perception. Because when horror works, it does so quietly. And when it fails, it's usually because the design is visible. These films work not because of what they show, but because of how they are built. 1. The Ninth Configuration, 1980. The primary mechanism here is dialogue dominance paired with visual contradiction. The film allows speech to control attention while quietly undermining it through composition. Scenes are structured around extended dialogue, encouraging the viewer to focus cognitively rather than visually. Meanwhile, framing choices introduce inconsistencies, imbalanced groupings, asymmetrical spacing, and environments that feel staged rather than organic. This split creates a perceptual hierarchy. Language occupies the foreground of attention, while visual information operates in parallel. The viewer processes meaning intellectually, while missing visual signals that contradict or complicate that meaning. The effectiveness lies in misalignment. The film exploits the viewer's tendency to privilege dialogue over composition. By doing so, it embeds visual instability beneath philosophical discussion. The trade-off is immediacy. Visual cues are subtle and easily overlooked. But that invisibility is intentional. The mechanism works because attention is redirected. Fear emerges not from what is said, but from what the frame quietly refuses to resolve. 2. The Beyond, 1981. This film relies on spatial incoherence through repeated threshold framing. Rather than establishing a stable geography, it consistently undermines spatial continuity. Doorways, corridors, and transitional spaces recur without clear relational logic. The camera frames these thresholds repeatedly, but does not clarify how they connect. Editing avoids establishing shots that would orient the viewer. This technique disrupts spatial mapping. The viewer cannot reliably determine where events occur in relation to one another. Locations cease to function as navigable environments and instead become isolated visual units. The effectiveness comes from fragmentation. Without a coherent spatial framework, anticipation becomes impossible. The viewer cannot predict where attention should shift or how scenes should progress. Orientation collapses. The trade-off is narrative coherence. The film sacrifices clarity and continuity, but this sacrifice is essential. By preventing spatial understanding, the film removes the viewer's ability to anticipate outcomes, ensuring that uncertainty persists independent of story logic. 3. Possession, 1981. The dominant mechanism in this film is controlled performance framing within unstable environments. While the performances appear volatile, the camera maintains strict compositional discipline. Characters are frequently framed against rigid architectural lines, corridors, walls, thresholds that remain visually stable even as behavior becomes erratic. The camera rarely mirrors emotional intensity with movement. Instead, it holds position, allowing physical space to impose order on human instability. This contrast is central to the film's effect. The viewer is presented with emotional excess contained within controlled framing. The image does not escalate alongside performance, it restrains it. As a result, attention shifts from expression to containment. The effectiveness lies in opposition. Emotional volatility is rendered unsettling precisely because it occurs inside an unyielding visual structure. The frame refuses to empathize. It observes. The trade-off is accessibility. The separation between performance and camera creates distance, reducing identification. But that distance is functional. By denying visual alignment with emotion, the film prevents catharsis. Fear persists not through intensity, but through sustained imbalance between behavior and structure. 4. The Changeling, 1980. The central mechanism here is temporal patience through extended stillness. The film constructs fear by refusing to accelerate visual information. Shots are held longer than narrative efficiency requires. The camera remains static while nothing changes. Objects stay centered in the frame without immediate relevance. The editing avoids interruption, allowing time to pass visibly. This technique alters the viewer's relationship with time. Instead of expecting progression, the audience is forced to endure duration. Attention shifts from outcome to observation. The frame becomes a site of scrutiny rather than movement. The effectiveness lies in anticipation without release. Stillness invites expectation. When that expectation is repeatedly denied, the viewer's focus intensifies. Silence and immobility gain weight simply by persisting. The trade-off is momentum. The film deliberately slows pacing, risking disengagement. But this sacrifice reinforces the mechanism. By extending stillness, the film ensures that any deviation, no matter how minor, registers immediately. Fear emerges not from action, but from the disruption of patience itself. 5. The Brood, 1979. This film relies on spatial compression and controlled blocking as its dominant mechanism. Fear is engineered through the physical arrangement of bodies within constrained environments. Characters are consistently positioned close to walls, door frames, and structural boundaries. The camera reinforces this compression by favoring medium and close framing, rarely allowing the viewer to perceive open space. Movement is limited. Escape routes are visually minimized. This technique works by reducing perceived agency. The viewer senses restriction even when no immediate threat is present. Space feels occupied before it is used. The frame implies limitation as a constant condition rather than a situational event. The effectiveness comes from repetition. As the film progresses, the viewer internalizes spatial confinement as normal. When escalation occurs, the lack of visual flexibility amplifies the impact without requiring additional devices. The trade-off is visual variety. The film sacrifices expansive composition and dynamic camera movement. But this restraint is essential. By maintaining spatial pressure, the film ensures that tension remains embedded in the frame itself, independent of narrative development. 6. The Evil, 1978. The primary mechanism in this film is perceptual instability through inconsistent framing. Rather than maintaining a coherent visual grammar, the film repeatedly disrupts spatial logic. Camera angles shift without clear motivation. Shot sizes change abruptly. Background elements appear and disappear between cuts without narrative justification. On a technical level, this creates a visual field that resists prediction. This instability affects how the viewer processes continuity. The brain relies on consistency to build spatial maps. When framing rules fluctuate, that mapping fails. The viewer cannot reliably anticipate where attention should settle or how space connects from one moment to the next. The effectiveness lies in uncertainty rather than threat. The film does not instruct the audience to fear a specific object or location. Instead, it removes confidence in visual orientation altogether. The viewer remains alert, not because something is approaching, but because the frame itself cannot be trusted. The trade-off is polish. The film risks being read as technically sloppy or poorly controlled, but that perception works in its favor. Apparent incompetence masks the mechanism, allowing instability to operate without scrutiny. The discomfort persists because the viewer cannot determine whether what they are seeing is intentional or accidental. 7. Alucarda, 1977. The dominant mechanism here is visual excess as attentional disruption. Unlike films that restrict information, this one overwhelms it. The frame is frequently crowded with motion color and competing visual signals. Editing rhythms accelerate without stabilizing focus. The camera rarely isolates a single dominant element, forcing the viewer to process multiple stimuli simultaneously. This approach exploits cognitive limits. When the viewer is exposed to excessive visual input, perception shifts toward general sensation rather than specific detail. Patterns, repetitions, and symbolic arrangements pass without conscious registration. The effectiveness comes from misattribution. The viewer interprets the overload as chaos rather than design, assuming a lack of control where control is actually present. Repeated visual structures become invisible because they are embedded within noise. The trade-off is precision. Individual images lose emphasis and interpretation becomes unstable. But this instability is the mechanism. By saturating the frame, the film ensures that its most consistent visual decisions remain unnoticed, operating beneath conscious attention. 8. Full Circle, The Haunting of Julia, 1977. This film relies on negative space management and visual withholding. Fear is generated not by adding information, but by carefully limiting visual confirmation. The camera frequently frames rooms with significant empty areas left intact. Background spaces remain visible, clearly lit and uninterrupted by movement. The film avoids cutting away from these areas, allowing emptiness to persist as an active component of the shot. This technique conditions the viewer to expect visual intrusion. Empty space is not neutral, it becomes a site of anticipation. Because the film consistently refuses to reward that anticipation, the viewer's attention becomes locked into a state of monitoring rather than resolution. The effectiveness lies in denial. By repeatedly presenting space without payoff, the film trains the audience to remain alert without release. The absence of confirmation becomes the controlling factor. The limitation is tempo. Scenes slow dramatically, and narrative progression becomes secondary. But that slowdown reinforces the mechanism. The film sacrifices momentum to maintain visual vigilance, ensuring that fear emerges from sustained expectation rather than event. 9. The Sentinel, 1977. The primary mechanism at work in this film is static observation and human stillness. Rather than relying on movement or escalation, the film uses immobility as a control device. Throughout the runtime, the camera repeatedly frames background figures in rigid, almost frozen positions. These figures are often placed at the edge of the composition, held in place by wide or locked-off shots. The camera does not follow them, isolate them, or explain them. It simply allows them to remain. This technique alters how the viewer processes presence. Human figures are typically read through motion and intention. By removing those cues, the film renders people visually ambiguous. They occupy space without narrative function, which prevents the viewer from assigning meaning through normal storytelling logic. The effectiveness comes from duration. The longer these figures remain motionless, the more the viewer becomes aware of them, not as characters, but as structural elements within the frame. They stop being part of the story and start behaving like environmental fixtures. The trade-off is clarity. The film risks confusion and interpretive overload. But that ambiguity is essential. By refusing to animate or explain these figures, the film transforms human presence into spatial tension, using stillness as a substitute for threat. 10. Burnt Offerings, 1976. The central mechanism here is environmental point of view substitution. The film consistently aligns the camera with space rather than character, subtly shifting identification away from human perspective. Shots frequently linger on empty rooms, staircases, and windows before or after characters enter the frame. Movement is often secondary to location. The camera behaves as if the environment has priority, anticipating action rather than responding to it. This technique works by recalibrating viewer alignment. Instead of following characters through space, the viewer begins to occupy the space itself. The house becomes the organizing perspective, even though it is never personified explicitly. The effectiveness comes from repetition. As the film continues, the audience accepts this perspective shift without conscious recognition. By the time tension escalates, the camera's allegiance has already changed. The trade-off is narrative warmth. Characters feel increasingly secondary, their agency reduced. But this reduction is essential to the mechanism. The film achieves unease not by threatening the characters directly, but by reassigning the viewer's point of view to something that does not share human intent. 11. The Medusa Touch, 1978. This film relies on architectural symmetry and visual suggestion as its primary mechanism. Fear is generated not through events, but through the persistent arrangement of space and perspective. Characters are frequently framed against rigid structures. Corridors, windows, reflective surfaces, creating compositions that emphasize balance and alignment. These frames remain stable even when emotional or narrative tension increases, preventing visual escalation. The effect is subtle but cumulative. By maintaining compositional order, the film associates control with the environment rather than the characters. The viewer subconsciously registers that influence is spatial, not personal. Power exists in placement. This approach is effective because it reframes causality. Instead of reacting to action, the viewer begins to read meaning into stillness and alignment. The absence of visual disruption becomes a signal in itself. The limitation is emotional distance. The film resists expressive camera work, which reduces immediacy. But that distance reinforces the mechanism. Fear emerges from structure, not intensity. The viewer is positioned as an observer within a system that appears orderly, rational, and quietly dominant. 12. The Devil's Reign, 1975. This film's dominant mechanism is sensory overload as visual camouflage. Rather than restricting information, it does the opposite, flooding the frame with movement, sound, and competing points of focus. Ritual scenes are staged with dense compositions, multiple bodies, layered motion, aggressive sound design, and abrupt cutting. The camera rarely isolates a single element for long. Attention is constantly redirected, not through subtlety, but through excess. This works by overwhelming the viewer's perceptual filtering. When too many stimuli compete simultaneously, the brain prioritizes coherence over detail. It tracks rhythm and motion instead of composition. As a result, background alignment, repeated imagery, and spatial consistency pass without scrutiny. The effectiveness lies in misdirection through saturation. The film does not conceal information, it buries it beneath volume. The audience assumes chaos is accidental rather than structured, which allows repeated visual motifs to exist unnoticed within the noise. The trade-off is precision. Individual moments lose clarity and narrative focus becomes diffuse. But this diffusion is integral to the design. The film sacrifices legibility in exchange for perceptual blind spots, ensuring that control is maintained through excess rather than restraint. 13. The Mephisto Waltz, 1971. The primary mechanism at work here is compositional alignment and symbolic framing. The film embeds meaning through visual arrangement rather than narrative explanation, relying on repetition and placement to guide perception subconsciously. Characters are frequently positioned in relation to recurring objects, architectural elements, or spatial groupings that carry implicit symbolic weight. These alignments are not emphasized through dialogue or plot acknowledgement. They are presented neutrally, allowing them to register without conscious analysis. The camera's role is precise but unobtrusive. Shots are framed cleanly with balanced compositions that appear conventional on first viewing. However, the repetition of specific visual relationships gradually establishes a pattern. The viewer may not consciously identify it, but the consistency affects interpretation. This technique is effective because it operates below immediate awareness. The audience absorbs meaning through visual exposure rather than explanation. By the time the narrative introduces overt thematic material, the frame has already prepared the viewer to accept it. The trade-off is accessibility. Viewers focused solely on story progression may miss the structural intent entirely. But the design does not require recognition to function. The mechanism works regardless of awareness, reinforcing the film's thematic structure through visual consistency alone. 14. The Night Visitor, 1971. This film relies primarily on environmental framing and off-screen space to create unease. Rather than using overt visual emphasis, it constructs fear through what remains persistently visible, yet unexplored. The camera frequently holds wide or medium-wide shots longer than necessary, keeping hallways, stairwells, and windows within the frame even after their narrative relevance has passed. These spaces are not highlighted through lighting or movement. They are simply allowed to remain present. This technique shifts the viewer's attention away from immediate action and toward spatial awareness. The audience becomes conscious of areas that could contain information but never confirm it. The film does not suggest danger directly. It establishes a persistent sense of spatial incompleteness. What makes this effective is repetition. The continued inclusion of unused space conditions the viewer to monitor the frame rather than follow the story alone. Over time, attention becomes divided and certainty erodes. The limitation of this approach is pacing. The film sacrifices narrative urgency and clarity to maintain spatial tension. Scenes feel deliberately restrained, sometimes static. But this restraint is essential to the mechanism. Fear emerges, not from what happens, but from the sustained possibility that something could happen just outside the visible field. 15. The Shuttered Room, 1967. At its core, this film operates on camera restriction and controlled visibility. The narrative itself is minimal, almost deliberately underdeveloped, which allows the visual structure to carry the primary burden of unease. The camera repeatedly adopts fixed frontal compositions that limit spatial information. Doorways, corridors, and interior rooms are framed in ways that reduce depth cues, flattening the image and making it difficult for the viewer to orient themselves within the space. Rather than exploring environments, the film presents them as closed system spaces that can be looked at, but not fully understood. This restriction works by denying the audience exploratory freedom. The eye expects movement adjustment or clarification from the camera, but those expectations are rarely fulfilled. As a result, the viewer is forced to process uncertainty passively. The film does not hide information, it simply refuses to emphasize it. The effectiveness of this approach lies in its neutrality. Nothing in the frame signals urgency or threat. The discomfort emerges from the absence of guidance. The audience is left unsure whether they have seen everything they were supposed to see. The trade-off is narrative immediacy. Emotional engagement is muted and character dynamics remain distant. But that sacrifice reinforces the design the film prioritizes. Perceptual unease over dramatic momentum, ensuring that tension is sustained through visual limitation rather than plot escalation. These films demonstrate that fear is not a reaction, it is a result. Across different styles, budgets, and eras, each of these works relies on constraint rather than excess. Information is limited, space is controlled, attention is redirected. The audience is not overwhelmed emotionally, it is guided perceptually. What matters is not what the film shows, but what it chooses not to clarify. Not what it emphasizes, but what it allows to remain unresolved. Fear persists because the design continues to function even after familiarity sets in. So the question worth asking is not which film is the scariest. It's this: which technical decision surprised you the most And which horror film do you think deserves closer analysis for how it engineers fear rather than performs it? If you want to keep examining horror as a constructed system rather than a subjective experience, this conversation doesn't end here.